Hi everyone. So this will go over the terms and theories for chapter 4, which talks about working beyond the sex gender binary. So this is the way we typically think sex gender works. Like you have certain genetics, you get certain hormones, that determines whether you're a girl or a boy. You say I'm a girl or a boy, and then you like the opposite sex gender. So we know it's not that simple. And again, for some of you, this might be new material. So welcome to the world beyond what we think of in terms of stereotypes. So gender identity is your understanding of yourself as gendered, and gender expression is how you manifest your gender identity. So everyone has a gender identity and everyone has a way they express that. So for example, like you could be born female at birth, identify as female, and dress in a more feminine versus more masculine way. And sometimes that'll vary day to day, right? Cisgender describes individuals whose gender identity conforms to societal expectations for the sex they were assigned at birth. So a lot of you out there might not realize that you are in fact cisgender, and you are. And then transgender is a gender identity and or gender expression that doesn't conform to societal expectations for the sex a person was assigned at birth. And even the term transgender is much more complex than we typically think of it. So this is a chart of the gender identities that fall under what they often call the transgender umbrella. Sometimes this is identified with just trans and then an asterisk after it to recognize that transgender doesn't necessarily capture all this. So you can be gender queer. So you're beyond the binary. You don't identify as female or male. You can be gender nonconforming. You can identify specifically as a trans woman or trans feminine, or a trans man or trans masculine. There are lots of different ways to identify as polygender, where you identify with all genders. Androgynous are people who believe they and feel like they have complete gender neutrality and then may express themselves that way. And then for people who are like, oh, this trans stuff is new and made up, the term two-spirited has existed in Native American cultures for centuries. And this is the idea that there are people who display characteristics of both male and female genders. And in fact, these people are very well respected within Native American cultures and may have roles as shaman or other religious figures. Gender transitioning is the process of publicly demonstrating your gender identity in appearance and behavior. When you misgender someone, that's using a pronoun that doesn't accurately reflect that person's gender identity. So this is why in your intro video last week, I had you tell us your pronouns so that we know how to refer to you. Because misgendering can actually be very difficult for trans individuals, and there are studies that show that if you just use a person's correct name and pronouns, it actually reduces suicide risk. So it's very important psychologically. Minority stress theory suggests that having a marginalized identity, and it's not just being trans, it can also be, you know, being a member of a racial minority group, having a disability, things along those lines, carries additional social stressors. So just being a minority is stressful in our culture, and that can negatively affect mental and physical health outcomes. There are 3 major stressors in particular that impact trans people. This doesn't mean that these are the only stressors, right? Discrimination and prejudice, internalized transphobia, where people who are trans have heard so many negative things about being trans that they internalize it and they apply it to themselves, and they have self-hatred as a result of it. And the threat of violence. So particularly trans women of color, for example, tend to have very high risk of being attacked or killed by others in society. Stigma awareness is a heightened fear of encountering future discrimination because of your awareness of the discrimination and stereotypes you've already experienced. Now, a lot of people think like, how do these trans people exist? There's just two sexes. No, not biologically at all. There's some great videos about animals and their different ways of identifying as different sexes or manifesting as different sexes on Blackboard. And even within humans, there's what's called intersex. And this is a wide variety of conditions in which chromosomal, gonadal, or anatomical features are not sex typical. So there's the same percentage of intersex people as there are people with red hair in our population. So not the most common, but certainly common enough that they're there and you see them, right? So this exists where can be as simple as, is that a clitoris or is it a penis when the child is born, right? Or it can be much more complicated. And it could be something that you don't even know about until much later in life, and maybe you have to have some medical tests done to discover it. So for example, Klinefelter syndrome is a genetic variation where you have more than one X chromosome. And then you can also have 1 or 2 Y chromosomes. So there are people who are XXY, XXYY. And so that's going to do a lot of things to you if you know anything, for example, about Down syndrome. Just having 3 chromosomes on chromosome 21 creates Down syndrome. So anytime you have extra chromosomes hanging out, it's problematic. Turner syndrome is where you actually have a chromosomal pattern of X and no second X, no Y. You just have one X. There are a bunch of hormonal variations that I won't get into all the nitty-gritty of. Your book does a great job describing them. But essentially, we often think like, oh, hormones just control of our behavior. But there are all these different variations where your body might not process hormones or may not manifest hormones in the same way. But you might be genetically XX. Sometimes intersex is referred to as disorders of sexual development. Some providers use differences of sexual development to try to address stigma. Obviously, like a disorder implies there's something wrong with you. The typical thing that medical doctors want to do, and often that parents want to do in these cases, are to do some sort of medical procedure to fix it, right? So these are often unnecessary. They're cosmetic. They don't benefit the individual. They can often even harm them because you're working on the genitals, and any sort of surgery might reduce your functionality and or your ability to feel stimulation down there. Genioplasty is the term for surgery on the genitals. It's complicated, it's unregulated, and there's a lot of different risks. And the medical gaze is a process where medical providers treat a person's body as like a thing to be studied, right, or fixed or worked on, rather than seeing that person as a person. And that is a big risk for individuals who are intersex or even trans. Okay, so we've just been talking about sex gender identification, and sexual orientation is completely distinct from that. A lot of people don't realize that. So your gender identity and your sexual orientation are two separate constructs, two separate things. So sexual orientation is your predisposition towards sexual and or romantic attraction for persons of the same sex gender and or persons of the other sex gender. And of course, beyond that binary. We tend to think of this in the binary. We tend to only think of it as heterosexuality, being attracted to the opposite sex gender, or homosexuality, being attracted to the same sex gender. However, that is a very limited way to look at things. This chart demonstrates just really a small percentage of the ways that people can identify. Asexuality is where you have low or no sexual attraction to anyone. Bisexuality, having sexual attraction to both men and women. Some people argue that pansexuality and bisexuality are the same. Some people argue that they're distinct. So I'm just putting that out there, that those are, that's controversial. Pansexuality is where you're attracted to anyone regardless of gender. So they could be non-binary, they could be trans, what have you. Demisexuality is, this occurs when you form a strong emotional connection with the other person, and that's the only time you feel sexually attracted to them. I think many of us might fall into that. Heteroflexible are people who are mostly attracted to people of the same gender, but might be occasionally attracted to other individuals. So that, you know, they're not identifying as one or the other or even bi, but they just say it's flexible, it's fluid. Queer is sort of an umbrella term that people use for these, and it really means different things to different people. A lot of older LGBT folks don't like the term queer because it used to really have a lot of stigma attached to it. A lot of younger LGBT folks really like and identify with it. That's why there's the Q on LGBTQ now, because it's more of an umbrella term. It's less putting you in a little box. And as you can see, you can even have a sexuality where you're attracted specifically to non-binary gender identified people. Now, just like any other minority status we'll discuss, there's of course people who have problems with it, and society as a whole just doesn't necessarily think about it. So heterosexism is the assumption that everybody's heterosexual, at least until proven otherwise, and that it's more desirable to be heterosexual. And heterosexism leads to things like non-representation of other sexualities in our media. So think about how difficult it is to find a romantic comedy, right, where you have a non-heterosexual relationship. There have been a couple in the past few years, which is great, but traditionally they've all been a man and a woman. People with non-binary sexual identities, sexual orientation identities can feel invisible. So particularly people who are asexual often feel like they're not represented or even acknowledged or discussed. There's not an A in LGBTQ, right? This is one of the reasons why a lot of people have been adding the plus to that. All right, so your book has this great diagram, which is off of a website, of the idea of the gingerbread person. And it really demonstrates that gender identity, sexual expression, and biological sex are three distinct things, okay? And that within each of those, you can be on different range for both the female woman aspect and the male man aspect. So it's not two ends of the same arrow, each is their own arrow that you might vary on, okay? And who you're sexually attracted to and who you're romantically attracted to may differ as well. Sexual configurations theory is the idea that sexuality is multifaceted, socially situated, and dynamic, and that we should understand it in a much more complex way than we typically discuss it. Sexual fluidity is part of this. This is the idea that sexual and romantic attraction and desire, as well as our identity in terms of our sexual orientation and our sexual behavior, can change over time. So a lot of people are now really arguing that they are fluid in terms of their sexuality, that they don't feel like they're just one thing or another. There's also a distinction between romance and sex. So for example, someone might be asexual but still feel romantic feelings towards other people, or you may be aromantic, experience of little to no romantic attraction. Monosexual is being attracted to only one sex gender, and as I talked about before, this is typically how we stereotype pigeonhole sexuality. So even if we think beyond just heterosexual, it's often just homosexuality, right? So people who are bisexual, pan, queer, non-monosexual have a lot of feelings of erasure sometimes, not represented. They have uncertainty even after they've adopted their label. And that's partially because of bi-negativity, where they've got social stigma directed at them. And it's from not only the mainstream heterosexual culture, but often, unfortunately, sometimes within the LGBT community. Even though the B is in there, there are people within the queer community who argue that bisexuality is not a thing and you're just waiting to choose or waiting to come out all the way as gay. Obviously, bisexuality exists. I hope that everyone here realizes that. And people who are bi experience greater levels of psychological stress because of this. Now, coming out is the process by which someone within one of these categories accept, appreciate, and inform themselves and others about their identity as LGBTQ+. Unfortunately for folks, this is a lifelong process. You don't just come out once, right? So because of the heteronormativity and the assumption that everyone's gender matches their sex, matches what's outwardly displayed, typically they have to come out to every new person they meet. So imagine that. Imagine if, every day of your life when you meet a new person, you have to essentially be like, I'm straight and I'm a female. Is how I would have to do it. It just gets exhausting. And it's associated with a number of risks, including victimization. So there are cases where people will try to sexually assault someone to turn them straight. That doesn't work, obviously, it just creates trauma. And it can be made more difficult by religion. So some religions completely reject or try to pray the gay away, use conversion therapy, which has been discredited by all major mental health fields as not only unhelpful, but traumatic in and of itself. And in fact, Virginia, just in the beginning of 2020, actually banned conversion therapy. Parental response is a key predictor of acceptance and emotional health. Parental response is really important because, in fact, the #1 reason for homelessness among LGBT teens is their parents kicking them out after they come out. And it's actually, I think, beyond just LGBTQ teens, just teens in general. So that is very important in general, getting that social support. Internalized homophobia, biphobia, heterosexism, or homonegativity is where you have internalized the cultural ideas about these things and the negative aspects, and so you apply them to yourselves. Coming out has been associated with positive outcomes, higher self-esteem, lower levels of depression, particularly if you do get that social support. All right, so I hope that this was helpful and enlightening to you all, and I will see you next week for the next module.